Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the Archaeologist, now let's get into the travels.
So this is the port of ancient Kition. No, where you are at the castle of Larnaca that was built by King James I of Cyprus in the 14th century. Oh, well, why didn't they use this? This is a perfectly nice port. No, see what happens is that ancient ports actually do silt up, including in Cyprus. And the port used to be up here, but all the silting of various rivers and erosions actually moved the port down there. Okay, well, why aren't I telling people that? I mean, I'm the one there. You got me, but point is, you're not there. Alright, so this is the port of modern Larnaca, and I'm about to be at the ancient port of Kition right now. Actually, no, you're not, because I actually filmed that joke before realizing that this port was closed, so we will continue this conversation at a part of Kition just up the road that is open.
A couple of months ago, I did a video on the Bronze Age collapse, but that video was incomplete. Now, naturally, a lot of my videos are, that's just the nature of archaeology. We deal with complex human societies and systems, and there are whole textbooks which are even incomplete. But still, I think in this case a follow-up video was needed. And in this case, the follow-up video is about Cyprus, and especially Kition, which I've wanted to visit for a very long time. Allow me to explain.
So one of the things I find most fascinating about Cypriot archaeology, and Kition is emblematic of it, is that it never really had a Bronze Age collapse. Now, I've said in a lot of videos that for every rule there is an exception, and for the Bronze Age collapse, Cyprus is that exception. As all these other areas in the Eastern Mediterranean were in decline, being destroyed, Kition was here growing as a major world port. It's something that was a small fishing village in the Bronze Age, by the early Iron Age one of the most dominant kingdoms on the island, and would remain so until the Roman Empire.
So today I'm talking about why this is, and how that came to be. Or at least the theories behind it, because records from this period don't really exist outside of archaeology. It's difficult to reconcile Cypriot chronology with the chronology of the Aegean and Eastern worlds, yet nevertheless scholars have tried. But the picture we get is messy. The gist of it is that as the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed, Cyprus rose. And before we begin, please remember to like and subscribe, and if you'd like to see more of this stuff, donate to my Patreon in the description below.
Okay, so Kition might be closed, but fortunately Amathous is open. And Amathous is also one of these ancient Bronze Age cities that was inhabited around the 10th century BCE, and remained inhabited for several millennia afterwards.
Both Kition and Amathous are perfect examples of this phenomenon taking place in the Bronze Age collapse. But it also feeds into my theory in my first video on this topic that the Mycenaeans were the Sea Peoples. Sea Peoples, remember, being the people who raided all of these major ports in the late Bronze Age collapse and are often cited as a source of it. But before we discuss that, let's discuss the archaeology of Cyprus in the Bronze Age collapse and the early Iron Age, including the origins of the Mycenaeans. Prior to the Bronze Age collapse, trade links between Cyprus and the rest of the world were already well established, and the island was known for copper by this point. We don't have a clear picture of the island, with accounts mostly coming from outsiders, but we do know that they were not Greek, though they were connected to the Greek world. Cypriots had intense relations with Crete and Rhodes, but little with the Hittites, and even had a Cypro-Minoan script. But as the Bronze Age ended, what we see is something interesting. The trade between the Mycenaean Aegean and Cyprus actually increases, while everywhere else it seems to stay the same. And while Mycenaean society had collapsed before it rose again on Cyprus, there does appear to be hints of Aegean raiders in Ugarit's communication with the island, which suggests in one paper by Degard Jalkotzi that Mycenaean society had already collapsed, perhaps which is why Mycenaeans arrived on Cyprus in such large numbers after the actual end point of their society. But where and when did this start? Well, there is an idea.
So, according to some archaeologists, the site of Maa-Palaeokastro is where the Mycenaeans first arrived on Cyprus. Now, if you're used to watching me, you're probably already going to know that I am going to say we don't know for sure. So why do some archaeologists think this? Well, it's because in Maa-Palaeokastro, there are very few large cyclopean blocks, and those ones that are there are completely unformed. What you do find here is some of the earliest Mycenaean artifacts on the island. So the fact that you find all these Mycenaean artifacts from the 12th to 13th centuries BCE, and that you find absolutely nothing afterwards, it does lead them to assume that this is one of the earliest occupations, and based on the lack of cyclopean architecture, it means that this site was not permanent, which therefore means that it must have been one of the first places they settled. So you can see the logic. It's fair logic. But again, to say that it definitely is also not a fair statement.
And indeed, there are a lot of scholars who doubt this claim. While there is an element of Mycenaean presence there, numerous sources, among them Bernard Knapp, who is one of the giants in the field, point out that nothing makes this particularly Mycenaean. And even if it was Mycenaean, there's nothing to suggest it was the first settlement. While it was only a temporary site that lasted 2 generations at the most and had Mycenaean presence, many of the elements here are also very Cypriot, to the point that the entire site may actually be local, or at the very least a joint venture. And archaeology does seem to bear this out, as Cyprus only has a small handful of destroyed sites in comparison to a dozen growing ones. Conquerors do tend to destroy things, yet destruction on Cyprus is limited. According to Knapp, too limited to call it a conquest. And it just doesn't look Mycenaean. It's easy to see why this might have been a mix of different cultures. But then why was this originally called Mycenaean? Well, because there really is a case for it. From Paphos to Kition, it's clear there was a lot of Mycenaean presence, and that it only happened after their mainland civilization collapsed. But where we do find any real detail, what we find is that Mycenaeans were responsible for a lot of large-scale development in the period following the collapse of their own society, but they weren't the only ones coming to the island, nor were they the only ones building. And it's now I want to turn to Kition, the city that most exemplifies this. Kition in the Middle Bronze Age was a small outpost, hardly bigger than a village, but it evolved in this time into a major urban center. By the 13th century BCE, Kition was the major port on Cyprus, and it was clearly Mycenaean in character. This is also problematic for the mixing theory because it's right near Hala Sultan Teki, a Bronze Age site that does appear to have been destroyed around about 1150 BCE, right at the time of the Sea People raids. This suggests that Mycenaeans not only came in large numbers to Cyprus, but that they did destroy cities, assuming of course you think it was the Sea Peoples who destroyed it. And while some scholars note that nearby Kition did rise again, larger and stronger than ever, to replace these old centers of power, one could also claim that this doesn't prove there wasn't a conquest, only that the conquerors found a use out of the same harbor. Although Hala Sultan Teki, it should be noted, was destroyed about a century after the first Mycenaean presence on the island as well, so it's not entirely a refutation either. We also see a shift in culture. Old cemeteries are abandoned in favor of new ones outside the city, and they start to look more like Mycenaean chamber tombs. They were also moved away from town centers, which was a rejection of earlier practices. While they are not on the same grand scale as the mainland, they clearly share similarities, but they are not quite carbon copies either. They are uniquely Cypriot in style. This can both prove mixing and prove conquest, for there was such a jarring shift in culture at this time, but there was also not a complete takeover either. And some sites, like Marian and Kalavasos, were abandoned without any sign of violence, suggesting a peaceful migration to these larger urban centers. Kition was the jewel of Mycenaean Cyprus, however, and one of, if not the only, city to truly flourish in the Bronze Age collapse. It had a massive fortified port, and it was still using well-established sea trade networks despite the known dangers, and it did it at a time when these trade partners were weakened and poorer. And Mycenaeans were busy on Cyprus, founding the cities of Amathous and Paphos and expanding them rapidly on what was previously sparsely inhabited, relatively unoccupied coastland, and they did it with seemingly little resistance.
And all this is to say that my theory that the Mycenaeans were the Sea People is actually supported by the archaeology on Cyprus, because when did the Mycenaeans get here? Well, it was the 1200s BCE. And when did the Bronze Age collapse begin? Well, it was about the same time. So when you see ports like this popping up, what's the one thing pirates don't do? It's raid their own port. So if the Mycenaeans were the Sea People and they used Cyprus as their base, it would make sense that this was the only place in the Mediterranean that was seeing expansion.
And of course, I also pointed out that there were problems with viewing the Sea Peoples as solely Mycenaean. Well, this can also be explained with the arrival of the Levantine refugees, because while Nkomi and Hala Sultan Teki show signs of destruction, other sites do not and even expand. And we see that this expansion had Eastern and local influences as well, so mixing obviously would have occurred, and there's proof in Kition too that not everyone here was Mycenaean.
So what we have here is Phoenician Kition, and this is some of the oldest temple architecture in the area. This was built in the 12th century BCE, and how do we know it's Phoenician? Because if I stand aside here, what we can see is that what we have is twin architectural features here that both appear to be of Syro-Palestinian in origin.
For the record, here's some Syro-Palestinian architecture from the actual Syro-Palestine region, specifically Israel, that I dug up dating from about the same time period as this Phoenician temple in Kition. Here's another example from Carthage, where I began doing these videos, which was another Phoenician colony. And this proves that there were also refugees and continued contact with lands to the east as well. During this time, we see Levantine influences with a number of ivory workshops and cylinder seals, distinctly Near Eastern traits. These could be found all over the island, including at the supposedly Mycenaean Kition. Kition did become a royal center, but whether this was home to an actual king of Kition is uncertain. This port also acted as the capital of Assyrian and Persian Cyprus, so it could easily have also been for governors, dignitaries, or visiting emperors. But either way, this made Kition coveted, and it changed hands several times from its growth in the 13th century onwards.
So what we have here is the oldest temple in Kition, and this was constructed by Mycenaeans as a temple likely to Aphrodite. At least we assume Aphrodite, given that we know the Mycenaeans worshipped the Greek pantheon and Aphrodite's later associations with Cyprus. However, after the Mycenaeans left, the Phoenicians came in, and the Phoenicians rebuilt this to be a temple of Astarte. And then when the Greeks came back, Astarte was once again Aphrodite.
Ultimately, it's important to note that, like everywhere else, there was no real coherent narrative for what happened on Cyprus during this time. What we tried to work from is later records, mythology, and archaeology, giving us a messy and hotly debated picture of the island. We know that some cities grew, but we don't know who grew them. We know that Cyprus felt the effects of the Bronze Age collapse in trade routes as keenly as other areas because we see this reflected in their traded materials. Yet, Cypriot cities were growing.
And again, this speaks as to how Cyprus was the exception to the rule of the Bronze Age collapse. Cities like this simply weren't rising up anywhere else in the world following the Bronze Age collapse. Yes, we had small kingdoms and we had small towns, but big cities and rich ports like this simply weren't happening. So the fact that Cyprus had many of these developing and expanding is very notable.
It might be possible to get some kind of narrative working backwards from the early Iron Age, but the problem is, we don't know a lot there either. Still, there is some information. The Assyrians gave us a geographic breakdown of the island's polities when they claimed to have conquered it in the 8th century BCE, as did the Persians, before the Greeks arrived. And what comes to us is the existence of at least 9 kingdoms, roughly looking like this. Okay, have you seen the map? Memorized it? Good. Now, forget it. It is junk. This map is used everywhere with discussions of Iron Age Cyprus online, but it is widely and universally panned by modern archaeologists. The borders are entirely fictitious, as Assyrian records merely give us city names and do not recount how much land they had or what they controlled. Indeed, the two Assyrian records don't even line up with each other, as the politics of the island changed even over a generation. But that obviously does not make Assyrian and later records worthless. Using the names and aligned with archaeology, scholars have suggested that the politics of the island were messy and chaotic as city-states vied for power over each other. This is especially notable because on other islands like Crete and Rhodes, we see a retreat from ports into the interior to avoid the coast. And Cyprus has a large interior, heavily forested and easy to hide in and survive from.
And it was here in the Troodos region that most of the people gathered their resources for things like copper and wood. You can see already that this is a very different environment to the Mediterranean.
Unlike Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mycenaeans, Cypriots could source their metals, wood, and stone from the interior of their own island, and didn't necessarily need the long-distance trade routes to survive the way the larger empires did. And we see this reflected in their elites, who indeed do start using locally made goods and stop using luxury items from faraway places, most likely because those routes had collapsed and they no longer had access. So when people on much smaller islands began moving into the interior, these Cypriots should have had an easier time with it, right? Well, you probably already know where this is going.
Now, some have theorized that, based on the law of resources, that the people of the interior should be quite rich and strong, but in fact the opposite is true. And this is just proof as to how important trade was to Cyprus. It wasn't enough that you had access to the resources or controlled them, you had to also have access to the ports and the means to ship them. Therefore, the people on the port were the ones who could block the riches coming in and out of the interior, and thus they controlled the interior kingdoms, not the other way around.
Looking at later periods doesn't seem to answer the question on whether this was a Mycenaean takeover or mixing. It's even more complicated when you look at how the island was split between Greeks and Eastern empires in later periods, and keep in mind that the local script, Cypriot, apparently remained in use, with one Greek leader using it for his dedications hundreds of years later, suggesting that local original Cypriots were still also playing a critical role. While Mycenaeans had a dominating presence, it's also clear that there was more going on than just a simple conquest. So really, the easiest way to answer this question is to dodge it. But I don't like easy answers. So having laid all this out in front of you, and yes, for the sake of time and sanity, I did have to simplify it, what do I think? Well, I think there was probably a lot of Mycenaean refugees who arrived, along with others from the Levant. As more and more arrived from the Aegean, clashes would have gotten more likely, and they would have come to blows, especially among those with military experience. Mycenaeans were coming in such large numbers that they even founded new cities along unoccupied stretches of coast and became the major culture. And founding new cities on unoccupied stretches of coast is different from conquering the island. It implies they didn't need to fight for that space and may have even been granted it thanks to their large numbers. Cyprus is not thought to have been unified in the Bronze Age, and it certainly wasn't in the Iron Age, so it's unlikely that the period of collapse was any different. And do remember, the Bronze Age collapse lasted 2 centuries. This is no small length of time. Any number of factors could have occurred, from unpaid mercenaries to desperate refugees to xenophobic locals to even just a large accidental fire that fools us into believing the destruction was deliberate thanks to its unfortunate timing. It could be through settlement, and it could be that some of these kingdoms, like Encomi, resisted and felt their wrath. At the end of the day, there won't be one answer, and it certainly won't be simple. But I do believe that there was a lot of mingling on Cyprus and a truly huge number of Mycenaean migrants, all of whom would have become poorer. And that they would have begun raiding, partially by opportunism of raiding weaker empires that were known to be rich. And it's very likely that this new, muddled group of people became the Sea Peoples. And we can even trace this archaeologically and historically, in my opinion. Cypriots in the classical era spoke the Arcadian dialect, known from the Peloponnese where the Mycenaeans are from. What we see as well is the ceramic culture developed on Mycenaean Cyprus is identical to the first phase of Philistine pottery, and it is contemporary. Remember, the Philistines are the only group of people that we know for sure are Sea Peoples, and more on that in my first video. This would also explain why the Philistines seemed to worship Eastern gods, if there were Levantine refugees as well on Cyprus mingling and mixing with their Mycenaean counterparts. It isn't actually as far-fetched as it sounds when we're dealing with polytheistic cultures. Because you already believed in hundreds of gods, what was a few more? And gods in these ancient cultures often had a geographic domain as well as a spiritual one. But this is just a theory, and not even a complete one. The idea of the Sea Peoples as Mycenaeans is popular, but there is significant pushback from other scholars, to say nothing of the idea of them being based on Cyprus, and my own views have evolved on the issue as well since doing research for this video. This is a complex topic, and I did a lot of research for it, and I still didn't cover everything. Cyprus was truly exceptional for how it thrived in the Bronze Age collapse, and whether or not it was a haven for Sea Peoples or refugees, it offers us an amazing, if messy, glimpse into this otherwise dark period. An island in the Mediterranean and an island of success and growth in a wider world that was experiencing neither. Anyway, that's all I have to say on Cyprus during the Bronze Age collapse. And there was a lot of it. And remember, I do read comments, so if you have any questions or would like to suggest a topic for a future video, please don't hesitate to let me know. Anyway, until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.